I've been told that you make the greatest biscuits of all time. And so I want to talk to you about so many things. But first, let's start with your ideal biscuit itself, because there are, a million styles of biscuit, right?
Yeah.
But to you, what is a great biscuit like?
For me personally, I like a biscuit that's sturdy. So, one that's kind of crisp at the bottom and,
Yes.
even though it flakes in the center, it won't fall apart when I bite into it. So when I bite into that biscuit, I want to pull it away from my mouth and it just still be intact with my teeth marks in it. For that biscuit to hold up to the gravy and don't fall apart, and more so a sausage and a runny egg or country ham can kind of, a biscuit can withstand that and not crumble to pieces. More sturdy than a softer biscuit.
But still light, still have a good fluff to it.
Yeah, still light. Yeah, I think the word I'm looking for is not crumbly. So it can be soft and light, but still sturdy.
Yeah. So here's the literal $1 million question. How do you make a biscuit like that? I don't need to get your recipe necessarily, but you're an engineer, so I figure you've got all the steps figured out. So what are techniques that you use to make a biscuit flaky, crisp on the bottom, but still have enough body?
Well, I do know for the crispness on the bottom of the biscuit, I kind of do at home. We'll do my cast iron skillet the way I do to make cornbread. And it's really how I learned how to make, biscuits anyway. So with cornbread, you melt the butter in the cast iron skillet, and then you kind of add some sugar to the bottom of it.
Oh, wow.
And then when you pour in your cornbread, you put that in the oven, let it get hot, and then once you've mixed the cornbread mix, you put that into the right in the skillet with the crisp butter and sparkling sugar. So once you've baked it and you take that cornbread out, it's got the sugar crust, which is the best thing in the world. So I just sort of adapted that same methodology to the biscuits at home. I let my pan warm up without the sugar and butter, but I let my pan get hot in the oven, and then once I put the biscuit rounds on there, they actually don't take that long to cook because they're crisp at the bottom. And I make sure that the biscuits are not touching so that it's kind of crisp all around, because the biscuits are touching side. It makes it soft versus having it crisp all around. And then I like to use an all-purpose flour. I have noticed that if you use King Arthur or Gold Medal versus the traditional white lily that you hear all the Southerners talk about, it does make a firmer biscuit. I do make them with the cake flour, all-purpose flour mixture, but those tend to be the more delicate biscuits for shortcakes or things of that nature. I tend to stay away from that particular type of recipe that utilizes the fancier flours, as my grandma would say, when I want to make a sturdy biscuit. I remember her telling me one time I had some cake flour in my house, and she said, "What are you going to do with this?" I said, "I use it to make cakes." She was like, cake flour to make a cake? She said, "That's what's wrong with y'all young folks. You got to have special stuff to make stuff nowadays."
I can hear that look.
Yeah, it was so sassy.
I definitely want to get to your grandmother's in a moment, but I want to keep getting on this biscuit, because the other question I always have with biscuit making is the butter, right? How do you treat the butter? How do you incorporate the butter?
Well, I cut my butter into a half-inch square to break it down, and then I'll cut it into the flour mix using a food processor if I'm making a big batch. If I'm making a small batch, I tend to use a pastry cutter or, fork or something to cut it in, because my body temperature is so hot. So it melts the butter. But I was taught to throw the butter in there and toss it in the flour and then snap your fingers. So take the butter and kind of snap it into the flour to get that, crumbliness. But my snapping turns into melted butter, so I try to keep my hands out of the flour.
Yeah. So in the food processor, how much do you want the butter cut into the flour typically?
Just, it's through trial and error that you learn. I've kind of got it down to where I can notice it's kind of crumbling, I don't know, a little bit more than pie crust, in my opinion. You want to incorporate it into the flour, but you still want it to, sort of see some of that butter, so that steam will help get that kind of flakiness that comes from the butter, separating in that dough. So
And then you mix in some buttermilk, and that's your dough, right?
I'm mixing some buttermilk. Yeah, I like thick, whole, fatty buttermilk. Cruz Dairy Farm out of Tennessee is just the Beyonce of buttermilk. I mean, it just really reigns supreme amongst all others, and it's so hard to get. Like, I'll drive to Chattanooga to go get, like a half a gallon and just go in Whole Foods and buy it all. And I know when they see me coming in there, they're probably like, Lord, here she comes. So, yeah, it's great, but all buttermilk is not created equal.
So just a nice thick buttermilk and a little mix, very light with the hand.
Toss it together just to bring it together. And then, my mixture sort of looks like a jumbled mess when I throw it onto the floured surface, where I'm just going to sort of pat it into a square. It kind of looks like, it does look like it's falling apart and it won't work, but it does. And then I sort of take the flour bench scraper and just sort of, to avoid my hands getting into it, and just kind of just put it into a square and like pat it down and fold it over a couple of times. Not much though, and then I'll just kind of cut it in threes and stack each layer on top of each other and roll it out and cut rounds or cut it into squares
And bake away.
and bake it in the oven.